Hi everyone, and welcome along to an exploration of cosmological arguments. So we're not just looking at one argument here, we're looking at a range of arguments that are termed cosmological, and we're going to look at what that means. But what all of these are attempting to do is to argue for the existence of God. And remember, the existence of the God that we're talking about is the God of classical theism, who is said to have divine attributes such as omnipotence, omniscience, omnibenevolence, and also this unchanging, immutable nature. Okay, so these cosmological arguments have got a lot to do if they're going to prove the existence of that God with all those divine attributes. So the word cosmological comes from the Greek for cosmos, which means universe. And this is really what all the cosmological arguments share. They are asking questions about our universe and what we know of it. So it's asking, why is there something rather than nothing? What caused the universe? How did it all begin? So this kind of questioning about what we've experienced and what we're experiencing makes it use a posteriori reasoning. So it's looking at our experience, and what this is going to focus in on then is our experience in the universe of things that start and things end, and things all seem to have a cause. So as I said, the arguments are a posteriori, and they tend to revolve around some really key ideas then that we experience in our lives. So a lot of what we're going to be considering comes down to causation and what it is to say that something is caused. It seems that everything has a cause, so it might be pretty safe to say, therefore, the universe must have a cause. So causation is really key. And we also look at the theme of contingency. Now, this is something we haven't looked at as much. Contingent things are things that might not have been. So I'm a contingent thing, you're a contingent thing. But actually, contingency often relies or is dependent, means you're dependent on something else. So we're looking at relationships and dependency. And we're also looking and thinking around this, that the idea that anything coming into existence, it must have a reason for it. Okay, so we can explain how things come into being. And there is an argument that we always need a sufficient reason, a good enough reason. And some of the people that we're going to be looking at say that God is the only sufficient or good enough reason for our universe. So again, it's a posteriori reasoning. So some of the people that we're going to be looking at then are arguing for God, and they might see this God as a first cause, a prime mover, a sufficient reason for things being. Okay, and they believe that creation that has taken place by God needs to be ex nihilo, and that's a Latin phrase meaning out of nothing. Okay, can you see why, if they are arguing for the God of classical theism, that this creation of the universe needs to be out of nothing? Well, I'm hoping that after thinking a little bit, you can think, well, it has to be out of nothing. Otherwise, God is subject to something. So if God is creating out of pre-existing materials, bits and pieces that are hanging around, we've got to say, well, where did they come from? If God hasn't got complete control, then God hasn't got complete power. So all of these arguments are saying that God, in whatever way they see God, in some way is behind the creation of the universe, which is ex nihilo, out of nothing. And that's so that God can retain its omnipotence, so having power over all things, including how they want to go about creating the universe. So types of reasoning. There are a range of arguments that cosmological arguments go under, and some of them are deductive. And we can see that in the Kalam argument and Aquinas' arguments. And remember, they lead to certain conclusions if the premises are correct. And then other arguments might be seen as inductive. So they are trying to persuade to a conclusion. So they come to a slightly weaker conclusion. And perhaps Leibniz's principle of sufficient reason is one of these. So we'll look at all of these later. Right, so this is really important for your understanding of the cosmological arguments. You've got to be able to identify horizontal arguments. Okay, so these tend to work like this. And we'll explain that going back in time. Or vertical arguments that seem to build outwards. So, right, let's just try and work out what horizontal arguments are then. So if you think of arguments that maybe you look at now and they say, well, this event in time was caused by this event, and that event was caused by this event and previous, and tracking back and tracing back in time until we say, well, things have got to start somewhere, like this domino, something has got to push that over. So we're saying that some arguments are called horizontal. It's looking at causation in time. So it's saying about events and preceding events in time. So we call these temporal arguments. And quite often for the cosmological argument, we're saying, well, we can't keep going back. We need a start. So horizontal in time, temporal. Okay, so an example of that is you're now watching this video, but it's because you've of another event that happened preceding this, and you choose philosophy A level as one of your subjects, and that might have been caused by this, that, and the other. But we can't keep going back, so we have to start somewhere. So these are horizontal arguments. Right, so we're saying that they're temporal. It's about tracing back in a linear way in time. Right, vertical arguments are the other type of argument, and all the other arguments that we're going to be looking at are vertical arguments, vertical cosmological arguments. Right then, what is a vertical argument? Well, it's saying we've got events and we've got things, and these can be explained, or the reason for them is something bigger than it. Okay, so we have to move outwards. But ultimately, we can keep going back for bigger and wider explanations. But ultimately, there has to be something that explains the whole. And I think we'll probably predict that this is going to be God in these arguments. So taking an example then from Aquinas, Thomas Aquinas, we'll look at him in a bit. So he says about a stick. There's a stick moving in water. Okay, so there it is. Now he says, how can we explain that? What are the reasons for that? We can't just accept that the stick is moving in water. It's someone's hand that's moving the stick in water. So it's looking at a wider explanation for that. But then we can trace it back again, can't we? And we can say, well, actually, the reason for the stick moving in water is the hand that moves the stick, but also it is the will of the agent. So I want to stir this. Okay, so we're going back to the will of the person to move the stick. So I'm just hoping that you can see, and this is the idea that I always like to think of. So this is the thing or event that we want to explain, and we have to do that by looking at the wider, bigger explanations to understand something. So vertical arguments for the cosmological argument are looking for a more significant explanation for what we can observe and see in our universe. So causation then in terms of wider explanations, and vertical arguments seem to focus more on dependency, on other things. Okay, so we've got two different types of cosmological argument. We've got the horizontal, we've got the vertical arguments. Now, you've got to have an awareness and a really good understanding of lots of cosmological arguments. So in a way, the rest of this video is going to be whizzing through some of the arguments you need to know. So we're going to be looking at Al-Ghazali's Kalam Argument. We're going to be looking at Thomas Aquinas' first, second and third ways, they're called, ways of proving the existence of God or arguing for God's existence. We're going to look at Descartes on his ideas of contingency. We've looked at them for epistemology before. And then lastly, we need to look at Leibniz's principle of sufficient reason. We won't get round to all those today. Let's start off with the Kalam argument. The key thinker is actually Al-Ghazali. So this is going back a long way to a Muslim thinker called Al-Ghazali. But the person here is William Lane Craig, and he has sort of brought these arguments, this Kalam argument, back into our awareness and talks and writes a lot about it. So the Kalam argument then, in terms of describing what it is a horizontal argument, and I'm hoping you'll remember that that means it's looking at things in time, okay, it's temporal, and it's an argument from causation, okay, and it runs as follows. So everything that has a beginning must have a cause. The universe has a beginning. Therefore, the universe must have a cause. Okay, so this is a deductive argument in its structure. And I want you just to start to think about what is being claimed here. So can you see in premise 2, we've got this claim that the universe has a beginning. So we are seeing that the idea of a universe that goes back and back and back and back forever and ever and ever, an infinite regression or an infinite universe, is ruled out at this point. Okay, what do you think? Do you think that maybe actually we could have an infinite series? And we are going to be looking at this as one of the big problems with this argument. Okay, so William Lane Craig adds that the Big Bang is an explanation for the beginnings of the universe, but the Big Bang itself needs more explaining. You know, where does it come from? You know, what is it there for? And Lane Craig thinks that God, actually, a personal cause, so a being with a will to want to bring about the universe, a will, a want, is a more convincing solution than a naturalistic solution such as the Big Bang. Okay, so that would be described as a naturalistic solution. Okay, so that's the Kalam argument. Okay, now think about premise 2 that you've just written down. The universe has a beginning. Al-Ghazali was convinced that the universe must have a beginning because the idea of something going back and back and back infinitely doesn't make sense. So he thinks that the idea of an infinite regression, now going back infinitely, he thinks is incoherent. Okay, now he thinks actually it creates, infinity creates a paradox. A contradiction. Okay, now this is his example to illustrate his point. So Al-Ghazali said that Jupiter takes 12 years to orbit the Sun, and Saturn takes 30 years to orbit the Sun. So Jupiter orbits the Sun twice as many times as Saturn. All right, everyone? Okay, so one goes around twice as many times as the other. So they're different. But if past time is infinite, so if things have gone back forever and ever and ever and ever and ever, then they both orbit the Sun an infinite amount of times. But this is incoherent. So infinity is impossible, and the universe must have a beginning. Now think, everyone, look. So Jupiter orbits the Sun twice as many times as Saturn, so they are very different. But both orbit the Sun an infinite amount of times, so they are the same. How can something be different and the same? Can you see it's a paradox? And this is what we are led to if we accept the idea of an infinite regression of events. How can something take twice as many times and the same time? It's incoherent. So Al-Ghazali then concludes that the universe must have a beginning because infinity is paradoxical. Okay, now it might be that you want to research into this, but this is exactly what the Hilbert's Hotel example is illustrating. So Google this or whatever search engine you like to use. Look at Hilbert's Hotel. It is another idea of the paradox of infinity. Okay, so Al-Ghazali's telling us that an infinite series isn't possible. It's a mathematical paradox. But actually, modern mathematics has shown that an infinite series is absolutely possible. And so this is a problem with one of our cosmological arguments, and that is the Kalam argument. So if we were to use George Cantor's set theory in mathematics, in which he uses transfinite numbers, which seem to explain the issues and apparent paradoxes of the infinite. So I'm not claiming to really understand set theory, but all we need to know is actually within mathematics, the concept of infinity is not impossible, and it's worked with and has been worked with for the last 100 years. So an infinite regression of linear events is mathematically coherent. So actually, that second premise, if you look back at it, please, on the Kalam argument, actually is sitting on very shaky ground. Okay, now very briefly then, we're going to whiz through the work of St. Thomas Aquinas. Now, Thomas Aquinas wrote in the Summa Theologica, he wrote 5 ways. They've become known as his 5 ways. And these are known as the 5 ways because he argues for God in 5 ways. Now, the first 3 of these arguments, or ways he argues for God, are cosmological arguments. Different forms, but all cosmological. So you've got to know, for the exam, you've got to know the first 3 ways. So our key thinker then is Thomas Aquinas. The sort of terms that he considers, well, he actually sort of promotes vertical arguments in which explanations get wider, and his focus is both on causation and contingency. Okay, so as I said, the Summa Theologica in the 5 ways. The first way is an argument from motion, the second way from causation, and the third way from necessary and contingent existence. So let's really whiz through this quite quickly. So you pause this and take some notes. But the first way for Aquinas was the argument from motion, but we might better understand it as change. So he says that things change and they move. So they move from a potential state, to their actual state. So if you think of an example, a silly example is you put wet washing on the line and it becomes dry. So it's going from potentially dry to actually dry. Now, premise 2, this change or movement has to be caused by something already in that actual state. So washing becomes dry and warm from the warm wind. Now, premise 3, things cannot change themselves, but must be changed by another. Premise 4, there cannot be an infinitely regressing chain of change and motion. Otherwise, there would be no start to the chain we have now. And of course, that's a ridiculous statement. We, of course, have a chain now. So therefore, there must be a first mover or changer. And this thing is unmoved by anything else. And everyone understands this to be God, says Thomas Aquinas. Now, basically then, this is a vertical argument. The first way, its emphasis is on the cause of change and movements. And a key sort of factor to this argument is the rejection of an infinite series that we've seen elsewhere in the Kalam Argument. Now, very quickly, let's just have a look at some of the immediate concerns with the premises in this argument. So let's look at premise 2. This change or movement has to be caused by something already in that actual state. So something's become hot, it has to be a hot thing. Well, Rowe comes up with this example saying that actually a plant can die, so that's the event. And that can be brought about by some kind of fungus that is very much living. So can you see that we can have something, the death of something, brought about by something that is, really vibrant and thriving, this fungus. So does it have to be caused by something already in that actual state? When we've got examples of the opposite. Okay, we've already said that this infinite regressing chain actually can potentially make sense, certainly in a mathematical sense. So we've sort of undermined this already. Oh yeah, look at this. There must be a first mover, changer, unmoved by anything else. And we've been told in premise 3 that everything needs to be changed by something else. They cannot change themselves. well, suddenly we've got a contradiction in logic. And finally then, this conclusion, everyone understands this to be God. Well, I mean, we could say, even if this argument works by saying there's got to be some kind of first cause or, prime mover, how does this even get close to proving that it is the God, and it's the God that we need to prove, the God of classical theism, with all the divine attributes that we've discussed before, like omnipotence and omnibenevolence? It surely can't get close to doing that. Whizzing on to Aquinas' second way, the argument from causation. And it sounds very similar to the first. So, premise 1, every event has a cause. Premise 2, nothing can cause itself, as it would have had to have existed before itself. Premise 3, there cannot be an infinite regression of causes, otherwise we wouldn't have had a start, and we would have no causes now. But of course we do have causes now. Therefore, there has to be a first cause, an uncaused causer, and this we all understand to be God. Okay, so the features are very similar. It's vertical, it focuses on causation, and we've got another rejection of an infinite series. Again, we seem to have similar contradictions. So here we go. There has to be a first cause, an uncaused cause, whereas we've already been told that nothing can cause itself. Okay, and everything has to be caused by something else. So we've got contradiction here. And again, we have got the same point here. We understand this to be God. And even if we did accept that we needed a first cause, how does it prove the God of classical theism with all those divine attributes? Now, the third way, Thomas Aquinas again, is the argument from contingency, or contingent and necessary existence. Very quickly then, contingent things, what are they? Well, these are things that have beginnings and ends. I'm a contingent thing, you're a contingent thing. Contingent things might not have been, or they might have been different for whatever reasons. Okay, so think of a situation in which you may never have existed. Okay, it doesn't take a lot to think about. So examples, you might be eating cheese. Can you come to a situation in which that cheese didn't exist? And I'm sure you can, for whatever reason. So contingent things. Necessary things are things that have to be or cannot not be. Okay, now with that in mind, let's look at the outlining of Aquinas' third way. So premise 1, all things that we're aware of are contingent things. So things that come and go, start and finish, could have been different. So premise 2, if everything was contingent, then it would be possible that everything at some point might have come to an end. I mean, that's basically because contingent things have starts and finishes, and they might have all just finished. And then, of course, premise 3, but if there was nothing, if everything finished, then there would be nothing now. But there is something now. Conclusion. Therefore, not everything can be contingent. At least one thing must be necessary, a thing that has to be, a thing that cannot not be. And this necessary being is God. Okay, so again, we have this vertical argument that's building outwards to bigger explanations for things, and the things here are contingent beings. And the focus is on contingency and dependence, how contingent things are dependent on other contingent things. But ultimately, that's not enough. Right. Okay, so whizzing on to one of the big problems with Thomas Aquinas' third way, this argument from contingency. Can you see that this is how Thomas Aquinas has it? He thinks that all the things that we see are contingent things. That's what CT means here. Me, you, all the different events are just contingent things. And he believed that we needed God to sustain these contingent things. Because what if these contingent things were going and then suddenly this one ended and there's nothing? And it wouldn't explain why we've got stuff now. So contingent things, me here writing on this. How would that be explained if at once there was nothing? So he sees God as a sustainer. Okay, but Mackie thought differently, and he thought, well, actually, we don't need God as this sustainer. Get rid of God, and we could have this, couldn't we? Can you see that it's quite possible that we have had an infinite series of contingent things that overlap? Okay, so these are sustaining existence. So it's perfectly possible, he says, that there is an infinite series of overlapping contingent events. No need for God. Okay. Right, so we have looked at the third way, and I just want you to recognise that Mackie's point is getting at this premise. So if there was nothing in existence, then there would be nothing now. But there is something now. Well, actually, we could just have those contingent, and so on. Now, this last point here is something that we will dwell on in future lessons. And both Bertrand Russell and David Hume really focus in on this word necessary being used about God's existence. So that's something for the future. So that was a long lecture. We have got a lot of content to get through. And next time we're going to be talking about Descartes and his contingency argument and Leibniz's principle of sufficient reason.